So I've thought a lot lately about what I enjoy most about well-written characters and stories, but something I haven't considered too much is what I like about well-written worlds. For me, most often the world building is kind of a backdrop to everything else, since I'm mostly a character and story-driven reader. However, it's undeniable that a well-written world sets the stage for everything you're experiencing in the story. Harry Potter wouldn't be as great of a story if it weren't for the equally magical areas surrounding Hogwarts, filled with their magical beasts or the struggle between Hogwarts, the Dark Wizards, the Muggles, and the Ministry of Magic. Even though a lot of that is kind of happening in the background, it solidifies the story in ways that enchantments and curses can't completely account for on their own. We're going to be diving into what makes a truly fantastic world from the perspective of us as readers. And I say we and us because I am joined by my friend and co host, Mick. We're going to help each other sort out our thoughts on what we love about well written fantasy worlds, as well as what we hate about ones that don't quite hit the mark. All right, so Mick, thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk about what, in our eyes, is a well written world. What are some of the things that really captivate you when you're reading about a fantasy world in one of your favorite stories?
Yeah, great question, Spencer. So, world building is something that we as reviewers we mention a lot when we talk about fantasy books. So, one thing that really kind of strikes home with me when I'm reading a fantasy story is that the world feels right for the story that's being told. So,
Hmm.
the example that I had for this is kind of a comparison between Mistborn Era 1 and Mistborn Era 2,
Hmm.
because in Mistborn Era 2, you've got this kind of darker story with the dark overlord, and you've got these ashes falling from the sky, and kind of this segregation of the ska people and the kind of regular people, the nobles. Um, Whereas in Era 2, it's a kind of a bit more lighthearted, a bit more of a modern story, and the characters are a bit kind of less bleak, and the world building kind of reflects that. It's a more kind of modern story, I guess.
Yeah.
And I don't think if you kind of swap the plots around of each of those stories, obviously there's things that would be different, the technology and stuff like that, but I don't see Wayne and Wax and Wayne being as effective as characters if they were set in the world of Mistborn Era 1.
That's a great point. I
Yeah.
had never really considered that before about how obviously the way not to spoil anything, but
Mm,
with the ending of the first Mistborn era, that changes a lot about the
exactly.
worlds as you go into era 2. And they're definitely as soon as you go into era 2, you feel the difference of kind of the atmosphere of the world building that's taking place.
Yeah, exactly. Like in Era 1, it's a very kind of life or death situation that you feel everything is at stake for the whole kind of three books, the whole mission, and there's there's feels like there's a lot more consequence, I would say.
Mm,
And then whereas in Era 2, it's more kind of a fun adventure. Obviously, there
right.
are still high stakes, but it doesn't feel as tense or as kind of detrimental to the characters because I think of that world that the story is set in.
Yeah, that's a great point. So for me, one of my points that I have in our notes here is I like there to be a mystery to the world, but not vagueness. And I think the example that I have for this is Wheel of Time. Now, we don't have a name as far as I know for the actual world that they're living in, but I
Yeah,
love that there's kind of this mystery where the book tells you that there was kind of a cataclysm between the events of the story that we're reading and what used to be. And the most notable of these differences is that men used to be able to use magic without going insane, and now they simply cannot. And of
yeah.
course, there's some caveats to that we find out later in the story. But it very much seems once Rand and his friends kind of get out into the world and start learning more about it, it becomes apparent that the world used to be a very different place. And the books don't give you all of those answers right away. Matter of fact, having just finished book 4, I still don't have a lot of those answers as to what the book or what the world used to be like. But I do feel like I'm going to get them at some point. And so the world has a mystery to it, but it's not vague to where I'm frustrated by it. And I'm like, well, it's just not telling me anything that I feel like I need to know. Whenever I'm reading Wheel of Time, I feel like it's telling me the things that I need to know about the world at exactly the right time, the times that make the most sense for the story that's being told. And I think that that's a really hard thing to pull off, probably. I mean, obviously, I'm not an author, but I can't imagine that that is an easy feat to make something both mysterious but also not vague.
Yeah, 100%. I had Wheel of Time down as an example for that too. I love in these big epic fantasy stories where you get little kind of in the first book, you might get a little line here or there about this far off place that sounds so alien to the characters, but then you eventually do
Yeah.
get there and you can see the differences in the world. Like, say, for example, like the White Tower or the Aiel Waste, something like that. And then you do get that payoff when it's necessary for the story, as opposed to just filling in to be like, oh, look at all this over here. And it doesn't have any payoff in the end. Whereas I
Yeah.
feel in Wheel of Time, like you said, you get it right when you need to. One thing I really love as well is kind of, I suppose, slightly ties into my first point, but it's when the characters kind of reflect the actual setting or area where they're from. So the example I had for this was in Game of Thrones, you've got the North and all the other seven kingdoms.
Mm,
Ned Stark is a character who embodies the North of Westeros.
okay.
So you can he's just got all the kind of characteristics of someone that's from the north. You know, they're hard, they're used to the bad weather, they're honorable, they have faith in the kind of more the customs from the olden times and stuff like
Right.
that. Whereas then you've got, say, families like the Tyrells down in the south, they've got the nice weather, more carefree lifestyle, more um, extravagant, have a life a bit easier, and they live life that way. Whereas these characters up the north, they have a different way of living because they need to in the world that they live in. And I think Westeros is a great example of that. Even though it's all the one kind of continent, you
Yeah.
feel like, and they're all the same race of people, they're all human, but they all have these different characteristics based on where they're from, how they live, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I also really like to not necessarily counter that, but just to kind of like
Mm-hmm.
add on to it. I like when characters almost kind of subvert the expectations of
Yeah,
where they're located. And I feel like that can do a similar thing where it's like, the people in this area are either like super evil or whatever. And there's like the one person that kind of stands out, and it makes that area more interesting if you find out that there's almost like a subculture of people that kind of subvert the expectations of whatever that culture is and whatnot. That's always really fun too.
yeah, definitely. I think like Bran Stark is maybe a good example of that. Like, you
Hmm.
know, he does embody the North, but he's got the dreams of being a knight, which is a much more southern
Oh,
um
interesting. Okay.
kind of way of thinking about it. Like up in the north, I don't think there are many knights. It's not something that's quite common. It's
Hmm.
viewed as more of a southern thing, and you know, like tournaments and these kind of things. You wouldn't want to have them in the middle of winter in Westeros up in the north. You know.
Yeah. Okay, cool. One of my next points is that I really like the world to be engaging. And I could certainly use an example of many different books that I've read. I feel like, King Killer, the map behind me, I feel like that's a really engaging world where you have different cultures like the Adem, the Edema Rue, and so many others, the university and everybody that kind of lives in the town around it. There's a lot of like my other point, like mysteries, but not vague. And every time I read those books, I find myself wanting to know more and more about these different like cultures and regions and just kind of like classes of people and whatnot. But my main example is King's Dark Tidings. And I think that the world in those books was done so well because you start out in a shy, and that's pretty much all you know. You just know, he gets into the city of I forget what the first city is that he goes to, but he kind of gets into that first city, and you get to experience that and see what the different like the Thieves Guild and all these other things that kind of thrive in the city in their own way. And then as you go on in the books, you each book is on like a different continent basically,
Hmm.
and you get to see different towns, and they all have a very very rich backstory. So there's this one, I think it's Gendishin, if I remember correctly, that he goes to in the third book, or maybe it's not Gendishin, but it's something over that direction where he goes there, and it's very common for every household just to have a ton of cats. Like they view cats as like this sacred thing. And so nobody is like mistreating cats. There's no like stray cats really. Like cats are always like adopted and put into like good homes and whatnot because they view these things very, very highly. Then
Yeah.
later on in the series, in the fourth book, he goes to a country that Lon Laresh that is ruled by women, like literally, what's the word I'm looking for?
Matriarchy.
Yeah, that's it. But literally, the roles of women and men are directly reversed to where
Okay.
men are in power or women are in power, and men are kind of sold and won and married off in the same way that women are in a shy.
Okay.
In a shy,
Cool.
you have like, your nobility that consists of mostly men and their wives, but men are definitely in power. And then you have the noble families that have daughters and whatnot, and they make deals with these noble men saying, like, I will give you a dowry, and I will, under these specific circumstances, like our families can unite, and I will give you my daughter. And in Lon Laresh, it's the exact same way, but it's just flipped. So
Yeah.
the noble families have sons, and they marry them off to these women that are in power. And often these women, they may have multiple spouses, and one may be there to raise the children while she goes off and does political maneuverings. And then one, they don't call them husbands, but for lack of better term, the other husband would maybe go and work construction all day and bring money in for the family. And it was so fascinating to learn, and every country in these books is like that. They're
Yeah.
all like super deep lore, super intricate, and it's engaging. It really, those are books where when I sit down to it, yes, I'm enjoying the characters, yes, I'm enjoying the stories, but also all of the places that Reskin and his friends are going. I just want to know more about the world. And I think that that's something that's really great about fantasy, is for the most part it doesn't take place in our own world, and these authors have the creative license to make up really cool political structures and hierarchy and whatnot.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really great point. And I know I've only read the first book in the King's Dark Tiding, but I did really like the city where that took place because it
Mhm.
can be so easy or so kind of predictable, I suppose, in fantasy series for these people who are on a quest to have to go to a certain city to pick up this magical artifact or meet up with this certain person, and the world that they're visiting then doesn't get explained enough. It doesn't
And
feel
it
like it's
blends
there to
together.
serve. Yeah, exactly. So it's good to get these unique different areas all in the one world and kind of have them there for a reason and serve a purpose and get expanded on in their own way.
Yeah.
Okay, one another thing that I wanted to talk about was kind of relativity to our own world, I suppose,
Mm,
which I know when we read fantasy books, it's all about escapism and getting these completely different things that we're not used to seeing in our own world. But one thing I do like is when an author can take something like a trope or something from our world and put a different spin on it so
mm,
that it feels unique in their own world. One of the examples I had for this was like Stormlight that's used in the Stormlight archive. So it's got these magical properties, but it's also used for things like just lighting up a house, like using it as a light
Oh,
source.
yeah.
And it's kind of you've got these gems full of this kind of magical power basically, and it's being used for such a simple reason, just to
Hmm.
light up a building or something like that. I
Yeah.
thought it was really cool. And another example I had was um I don't know if you've read Discworld. I've only read a couple of the books, but there's one, it's called Going Postal.
Hmm.
And it's basically this guy just reforming the postal service in the world of Discworld, which sounds pretty stupid, but it's actually really cool. A very fun story. You know, you've got a lot of similarities, but in the Discworld story, obviously, there's a lot of quirks about it, like we talked about when we did our 1-star reviews, a lot of
Hmm.
quirks in that. Um, but I think it's a really cool spin on just what seems like such a boring task of reforming the postal service. So something I really like.
That's fantastic. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's fun in the same way it's fun when you get into the Dresden Files. And for anybody that's read that series, they know that technology does not, like, simply does not work around magic. Like
yeah,
Harry Dresden, he can't have a television or like an alarm system on his house or anything. And so they have to find magical workarounds for everyday things. And so you'll see him put up these wards around his house that essentially do the same thing as an alarm system. It alerts him in some way if somebody is coming to the door or whatever. And then we even see like basically like communication devices, like how we would use cell phones, but it's through like a magical object that they're able to talk to each other with. And so I always think that that's really fun when they find some way to use magic for like everyday uses.
yeah. And I think consistency plays a big part in it as well, because you see it in a lot of, it's more in movies, I guess, where, say, for example, it was a movie of the Dresden Files and he can't use phones in the first like half hour. And then by the end, he has to use a phone to,
You're right,
you
for
know,
the
save the
plot.
day in
Yeah.
the end. Yeah, exactly. Just because they can't think of another way to do it.
Yeah.
So consistency is a big thing there as well.
Yeah, consistency is a great point. I can't think of any examples off the top of my head, but there's definitely, actually, maybe Harry Potter. I'll talk about this in a little bit. But
Okay.
there's certain times in Harry Potter where something will be set up earlier in the story, like this either can be done with magic, and then later they say that it can't be done, or like
Yeah.
vice versa. And so consistency is really great, and it's really important because readers remember that stuff. Like it may
Yeah.
seem like some minute detail might just be kind of like swept under the rug, and for the most part I do sweep that kind of stuff under the rug. I give a lot of grace as far as like magic and world building are concerned.
Hmm.
But readers definitely notice it, and they will definitely call it out if something is like not quite connecting in the world.
Yeah, I wonder if that's one of the reasons why Sanderson's so successful, because he literally has every
Yeah.
single detail planned out about what exactly can his magic do, what exactly can these people do, and stuff like that.
Yeah, Sanderson is a great example of, he outlines his worlds to a T, and he
Yeah,
makes hard and fast rules that are like, no, this is how it operates. And, when you hear that, the casual reader might think, well, that sounds boring. There's not a lot of room for like magic. But
yeah,
what Sanderson does so well is he sets down those rules, and then he finds loopholes. He finds loopholes within his own world to
hmm,
make the big, explosive, fun things happen. But he
yeah,
does it in a way where he's still following the rules. And you're like, oh, I didn't think that they
yeah,
could do that when I first like saw the rules of this system. And
yeah.
so
He does it really well.
yeah, he's really great at that. So, my last point that I have here for this section is I love when the world sets a tone. And I think that this is specifically relevant to Grimdark. I did a video a while back I'll try to remember what it was and put it in the annotations. I may just forget which video it was, but I was talking about how grimdark isn't necessarily, I mean, it is characters that are morally gray, and it is like, bad things happening. But a lot of it really has to do with the world. When you're reading Grimdark, you want the world to feel extremely oppressive and just gray, like morally gray, just the whole world being very hopeless. And there's not really a whole lot of rules. There's not really a whole lot of good guys. And you can see that in the world that there hasn't been a whole lot of knights in shining armor saving the day around here. It's pretty
Mm.
hopeless and bleak. And that's what I really love about Grimdark. It largely comes down to how the world is built. And the best example I have for this is the city of Dorsey in We Men of Ash and Shadow. I've said in all my reviews for that book is that Dorsey feels like a character, even though it's the city that they're all residing in. The being that is that city feels like a living and breathing thing, because there are, I don't know if I would necessarily say rules to it, but there is a culture to that city that you very much feel from the first page. Right from the get-go, we're looking at our main character is in a bar where they primarily serve roadkill, and that there's prostitutes in the bar that are missing appendages, and it's just like, oh, this is like a dirty city. And it just sets the tone for the whole book and the second book. And matter of fact, in the second book, there's one storyline that's taking place in Dorsey and another storyline that's taking place in another city that is a little bit brighter and happier, but it has some underpinnings of kind of like a dark underbelly of its own. And, you feel that in a very different way. And so I think it's really cool when world building can not only set the tone for like what the characters are feeling or like what they're doing within the story, but set the tone for the book as a whole. You feel like you're in this place and you feel the emotions that that city is trying to convey to you, or that country, or whatever it is.
Yeah, that definitely. Yeah, it's a very immersive kind of setting in We Men of Ash and Shadow.
Mm,
I felt like I could really visualize the city of Dorsey extremely well, and it wasn't because the author was giving pages and pages of description. It was because of
right.
how the characters were interacting around the city and everything like that. So
Yeah.
it was a very immersive and really set the tone for the story. You're right. Then my final point that I want to talk about is the different cultures that you can have in your world. So we did kind of touch on this with a few of our other topics. Some examples would be like Stormlight Archive, Wheel of Time, but
Mhm.
I just had to mention Malazan, obviously.
Ah,
Uh, but you've got all these different locations, and the people within these locations are vastly different. So, you've got like the humans, the members of the empire. You've got these kind of native people who walk the plains, who are kind of nomads.
mm,
You've got immortal kind of creatures that live forever. Some of them migrate, some of them are holed up in certain cities, certain parts of the world. But you feel like these different cultures definitely help to expand the world. You don't feel like everyone is the exact same and just going set in a different location. You feel because these people are so different, they make the kind of the contrast between the different cities and countries, whatever it is, feel that much more different.
yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. I love, we talked about it earlier, kind of going to different countries and different books, like in King's Dark Tidings, and just
Yeah,
getting super what's the word, just learning about how these different countries or cultures differ from the others, but somehow they're all able to exist in the same world. And I think what some authors do really well is, even though these places are very different, they all feel like they belong to this world. They all
yeah.
feel interconnected. There's some sort of thread that connects all of them. And
Mhm.
I think, that usually comes with a really well crafted world building system. So let's go on to what is a badly written world in our opinion? Do you have any do you have any ideas on, what, not necessarily specific books, although we can talk about
Mhm.
that as well, but just anything where you got through it and you're like, man, I didn't really connect with that world. It was just kind of there in the background.
Yeah, definitely. So, um, one thing I don't like is isolation in the story. So
Hmm.
I like it. I like an expansive world with a lot of things going on. I don't like things to be set in one place, only take place there, only have characters from that one region or city, and not get a feel for what the greater world is like. Some stories only allow for that. They might only be a short story or a novella or something like that. You
Right.
can't expect them to travel the whole country in the space of a couple of hundred pages. But I just like I much more prefer when we get the feel like there's something else out there as opposed to just
Yeah.
what we're facing in this story.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. That's actually something, after praising Dorsey as much as I have, that was
Hmm.
something that I actually talked to Holly about, I think when we did our first interview with her. And I was like, I love Dorsey and I love this kind of world that we're being put into, but what's happening outside of it? I feel like I don't
Yeah,
know anything really about the world outside the gates of Dorsey. And she had basically told me that that was on purpose for that book. And in the second book, we do see it expand a little bit. And hopefully, in the third and fourth books, we'll see it get expanded even more, because even if the whole story is just taking place in one city, I feel like I, as a reader, don't mind that so much, but I do want to know like what's happening outside, like what's the news from the
yeah,
other parts of the world, I think.
yeah. It can lead to kind of overexposure where you end up getting sick of that one place, and it maybe can tarnish your view on the actual story itself.
Yeah, yeah. Mine is too much exposition,
Mm,
lore that isn't necessarily for the story being told. And, as most of our viewers know, one of my favorite books of all time, it was my number one favorite book of 2022, I believe, is We Break Immortals. I absolutely love that book. I sing its praises all the time. But what I said in my review is one thing that I didn't really like about it is that there's a lot of world building, which is great. It has a really fantastic world that I loved a lot, but there was a lot of info dumps where it's talking about the history of a certain cathedral or a tower or something, and I was kind of like, oh, that's awesome, but it's not relevant to the story that I'm experiencing in the moment. Like, I want to get
yeah,
back to the characters and find out how they're going to finish their quest or whatever. And so I think, I think that authors, not every author, but I feel like there are a lot of authors that really get into their world building, and I think that's awesome. But then they then they include their notes,
yeah,
that their pages of notes that they made up for the world. And like, I couldn't imagine, Brandon Sanderson probably has books and books and books and books of notes that are just extra world building stuff that he doesn't include in his books. But one thing he does really well is he takes what the reader needs to know and he
yeah,
puts it in his book, and there's not a whole lot of extra exposition,
yeah.
from like other parts of the world that we don't necessarily need to know from for the story being told.
Yeah, 100%. We Breaking Models is one I gotta read soon. You're always talking about it, and I just
Oh
watched
yeah.
Jim's review the other day,
Yeah, Fantasy for the
about
Ages.
Fantasy for the Ages. Yeah, thanks. The name was slipping my mind. And I watched his review, and he seemed kind of, because I know he wasn't at the start.
Yeah.
I think he came around on it.
Yep. I
Yeah,
told him, I was like, man, please just do me a favor and keep going. Like, just please keep going. And he was like, okay. And sure enough, he came around like a full 180 on that book, and I could not have been happier. It literally like made my day yesterday.
yeah.
So yeah, your turn. What's a badly written world trope?
Yeah, so one thing I don't like, it primarily happens in urban fantasy series where you've got the magical side of things and you've got the everyday life sort of
Hmm.
things. One thing that kind of irks me a lot of the time when I read those types of stories is when like the general public are so unaware of something that is like
So
literally
prevalent.
constantly so
Yeah.
prevalent, constantly happening. Dresden Files isn't too bad from what
Hmm.
I've read so far.
Yeah.
And Harry Potter, because they've got nearly the separation with like the muggle world and the magical world, it does feel like two different areas. So I can understand the lack
Yeah.
of knowledge there. The example I had for where it happens and I really didn't like it was the Rivers of London series. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've heard of that one.
I've heard of it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of like a British Dresden Files, but not good. And you know, there's it's all set in London, obviously, and there's this guy works for the police force and he works for the magical department of the police force, and only certain people in the police force know that this task force exists, but there's like they encounter so much magic all over the place. It's like, how is it being kept so secret and people being so naive about it when it's kind of
Yeah.
so happening so often, so prevalent?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's definitely tough. I feel like some of those urban fantasy books really require the reader to oh, what's the
Suspension of disbelief kind of thing.
suspension of disbelief. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly it. Yeah, you really have to kind of be like, okay, the normal people just don't know about
Mm.
this stuff. And luckily, something like the Dresden Files, I'm not necessarily in love with that world building, and so that is kind
Hmm.
of a book where like I love the story and I love the characters, but the world could really be anything, and I think I would probably feel the same about it.
Yeah.
The fantasy world of Chicago in the Dresden Files is very much a backdrop, and there is a lot of like things that happen just to kind of advance the plot a little bit. And Jim Butcher has definitely put rules in place where it explains why the world at large doesn't know about these supernatural beings, but there is kind of a level of really though, like
Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
could definitely understand that for sure.
Yeah.
My last point on this is not enough exposition. And I think that, one my most recent example for this, as much as I love the world of Harry Potter, and we do get a lot of really cool things that we learn, like I said, the dark wizards versus the Ministry of Magic, the Ministry of Magic versus Hogwarts, and kind of the wizards versus the muggles. And so we get a lot of really cool things there, and we get to see a lot of really cool magical beasts and stuff. But there are some things where it's like I would have loved the history of Hogwarts and like learned like exactly how Hogwarts came to be and what the inciting incidents were leading up to that. And we do get a little bit of that, but not enough for my liking. And then there's like some magical stuff that doesn't quite make sense. Like in one of the early books, Harry is sitting down with Hagrid and another teacher, and they're pouring drinks and they're going back and forth, like just basically drinking all night. And Harry is kind of sitting there and replenishing the pitcher of like brandy or whatever it was. And like every time it would get low, he would cast a spell that would refill it. But then later in the book, in the Deathly Hallows, I won't spoil anything, but there's a point in that book where him and Hermione and Ron are in desperate need for food, and they have nowhere to get food except for like occasionally. And I'm like, well, wouldn't you be able to find that little bit of food occasionally and then like multiply it and have it
Yeah.
all week? And so there are some things that don't quite make sense with that and don't quite make sense with the magic. And Harry Potter is certainly a series that requires a massive amount of suspension of disbelief, and I think that's kind of the point. And we'll talk about soft and hard world building here in a minute, but I think that that's kind of what Harry Potter leans into.
Yeah. And I suppose a follow-up question on that, which would you prefer in a story? Would you prefer too much exposition or not enough exposition, which you think is
I think I would prefer not enough exposition because I think the times that I've been reading something and there's just been a big info dump about the world,
Mhm.
it's almost automatically a DNF for me.
Okay.
Whenever I get like a big block of text that's just about the world, I either like skip that segment and try to get on to the rest of the story, or if it's been doing that a bunch of times, then I just kind of DNF the book. But not enough exposition. I can at least still enjoy the characters and the story that's being told without the info dumps getting in the way.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good point. I'd probably be the other way around. I like the exposition sometimes.
Malazan.
Yeah. What can I say?
Yeah.
I say.
Did you have any other ones in that category?
I might just hit on the stereotypes one,
Okay.
maybe just quickly.
Yeah.
So one final point on badly written fancy worlds. I feel like stereotypes and tropes can get overdone and just become pretty boring. A lot of them seem to play on the kind of standard that's been set by the Lord of the Rings. You know, you've got elves are these ancient wise people, they're great archers, humans are brave warriors, trolls and orcs are evil, and it
Yeah.
just gets very repetitive and you just sometimes you just want a bit more variety, a bit
Yeah.
more kind of nuance with the types of characters, the different species that you have in the world, and not just fall into the exact same category that they do in other books.
Yeah, that's exactly the problem that I had with the Rhyria revelations.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, we talked about this, I think, in our last video we did together.
Hmm.
But yeah, I felt like at first it seemed like the world was going to be kind of this really unique thing where you have these two friends and one is like a half elf and one is a human, and it seemed like there was going to be some more variety from there, but then
Yeah,
as the story goes on, it's like, no, it's pretty much Dragonlance. Like there's dwarves and elves, and they just kind of do the typical like dwarf and elf things.
yeah,
And it's very kind of like samey and stereotypy. And
yeah.
so that, yeah, that was definitely something that that was probably the reason why I stopped reading Rhyria, because I was like, I just feel like this has been done so many times.
Yeah. And then you get a story like Kings of the Wild, and
Yeah,
they show so many different kind of twists and turns on these classic fantasy characters, the
yeah.
rogues, the warriors, the the archers, stuff like that, you know?
Yeah, that Kings of the Wild is interesting because you have all of the typical fantasy stuff, but
Yeah,
the way that he implements them in the story is completely unique and unexpected.
yeah.
All right, so let's go into talking about soft versus hard world building. And just like soft and hard magic systems, soft and hard world building are kind of the same thing. Some worlds you get again like too little exposition, and it doesn't really tell you a whole lot about the world, and you kind of find out more about it through each book in the series, and there may be some unexpected things that kind of happen for plot convenience, like, oh, we needed dragons to exist. So you find out in book 5 that there are dragons out there somewhere, and now our main characters are fighting them, rather than in book 1, starting out in a small town and having some guy say, I heard that there was dragons out in this area, and then it pays
Mm,
off later in 5. That's more of an example of like hard world building where things are foreshadowed and there's rules to the world and it all kind of connects in a very like Sanderson type way.
mhm.
And so yeah, let's start with soft world building. Do you have any examples for like what a soft world would be like?
Yeah, so I guess just piggybacking off of the last point there where we talked about Kings of the Wild, that would probably be an example of a soft world building in a story because you've got these things just pop up kind of chapter to chapter. You know,
Yeah.
there's a lot of just spontaneous monsters approaching, or
All of a sudden Moog has like a bag that he can pull chicken out of.
yeah.
It's like, where is the precedence for that in the story? There's not one.
Yeah.
It's just magic and it just works how it works.
Yeah. I think because it's so fun and such a novelty, it pays off. Whereas in
Oh
other
yeah,
stories, you might get sick of that. But
right.
just because there's such unique twists and just so creative in
Yeah.
everything that he does, I think it really works.
Yeah. I think another one for me is we talked about Harry Potter, and that's certainly one where it's part of the magic of the book, in my opinion. Like normally I would get not upset, but I would be kind of annoyed by this. But part of the magic of the book is that you don't know what is possible in this world. Like, why can Arthur Weasley's car fly? Well,
Yeah.
because it's enchanted, duh. Like,
Yeah.
it's not,
Yeah.
there's not any like rhyme or reason to a lot of the stuff. I would say that Harry Potter has actually a lot more um like hard facets to the magic and world building than I initially thought going in, but it is
Hmm.
undoubtedly like a soft magic and soft world building kind of system. And yeah, I think that, Harry Potter is a great example of, I think it's in book 4, where it's like, oh, now they have to fight a dragon. I did not know that there were dragons in
Yeah.
this universe. Okay.
Yeah.
But it all works really well. And I think the way that it works well is because pretty much right from the beginning of the series, you already don't know what to expect, and you're kind of finding these things out as Harry does. Whereas
Hmm.
where it would be implemented badly is if from the beginning of the series you were following a character who is very knowledgeable about the world, and then you find out in book 5 that there were dragons. It's like, really, that never came up in a
Yeah.
conversation at the pub or anything? Like, that's odd.
Yeah.
But with Harry Potter, he's an 11-year-old boy being thrown into this wizarding world, and you're kind of finding things out at the same time that he is. And so I think it's a soft magic and soft world building done really, really, really well.
Yeah, for sure.
Have you read Lovecraft, any of the Lovecraft
No,
books?
I was literally gonna ask, just about to ask, what kind
Yeah.
of world building
So I
would
I
take
read
place in those books.
I read some Lovecraft stuff over the past year,
Mm.
and I've really fallen in love with it. I definitely need to read more, and I know that there are probably Wikipedia pages out there and stuff that kind of connect all the stories in different ways. But whenever I pick up a Lovecraft book, or at least the ones that I've picked up so far, it feels like I really don't know a lot about like where Cthulhu came from, or a lot of these
Hmm.
other like dreamer kind of monsters. Like there's not a whole lot of information presented to the reader. Like with one of his books, Shadow over Innsmouth, our main character shows up at this seaside town, and all of a sudden all these really weird stuff starts all this really weird stuff starts happening, and it doesn't really get explained. Like we get enough to like complete the story and like have like a final resolution to the story and stuff, but it doesn't
Hmm.
go into the lore of where these cultists and monsters came from that are attacking him. He just gets there and rents a hotel room, and then at night all of these weird like monsters and cultists start coming by his room and trying to torment him, and
Mm.
he has to run for his life, and they kind of like hunt him down and whatnot. And so it's really interesting because it's an enjoyable story, and there's definitely a mystery there, and the mystery is enticing. Um, and you could look at this in one of two lights. Either you could say, well, it didn't really pay off in the way that now I understand, what these cultists are and stuff. Or I was more in the camp of like, I had no idea like what any of those guys were doing, and it really makes me want to dig into the rest of his books and see if there's an answer out there somewhere.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it could go really one of two ways with Lovecraft. I think that I would totally understand if it just wasn't for somebody and they're like, I need some more information given to me.
Hmm.
But for me, it really, really worked.
Yeah, sometimes it can still just click. I know for me, I do like that kind of bit of background information A classic one in fantasy is the Dark Lord, who's just evil because
because
they're
they're evil.
evil.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas in a lot of grim dark stories, you tend to get the perspective of the antagonist as well, which I
Yeah.
really enjoyed, to get a bit more understanding of how they came to be that type of person, what led them to these choices that they had to make. And a lot of times it can kind of redeem them in the reader's eyes as well,
Yeah.
which I think adds an extra kind of layer to the story.
Yeah, definitely with villains, I like there to be quite a bit more information. I actually get pretty frustrated when there's not more information on the bad guy.
Yeah,
But yeah, I think, kind of a good thing to go along with that Lovecraftian thing of, going into the story and not being presented with a whole lot of information as far as the world building or magic goes. Hayao Miyazaki, who is the creator of Spirited Away, and the other Studio Ghibli films. I'm not going to read the whole quote here, but he talks about how he uses some logic for his worlds, but mostly he's trying to evoke a feeling. And he talks about, the main character of that movie, how she, I can't remember if it's at the beginning or if it's it is at the end of the film. The scene in which Chihiro takes the train all by herself, and in his quote, he says, "That's where the film ends for me. I remember the first time that I took the train alone and what my feelings were at the time. To bring those feelings across in the scene, it was important not to have a view through the window of the train like mountains or a forest. Most people who can remember the first time they took a train all by themselves remember absolutely nothing of the landscapes outside the train because they are so focused on the ride itself. So to express that, there had to be no view from the train." And so I thought that this was really interesting because it got me thinking about Lovecraft and how, with that Shadow over Innsmouth book, that's one of the few books that genuinely gave me a little bit of a scare. Like when he's in the
hey,
hotel room all by himself and he can't see what's on the other side of this door, but he knows that they're really strange and weird creatures that are out there, and they're coming by and like knocking on his door and like coming up to his window and stuff like that. And it gives you a sense of fear of the unknown. And that's what a lot of that book did really, really well, because it doesn't give you, the Brandon Sanderson world building of what these creatures are. You just know that they're freaking scary.
yeah,
And that's all you know about them. And so I think that that's kind of what makes that book a little bit better, is it's evoking an emotion rather than kind of feeding the logic side of your brain.
yeah. It's like, oh, it's the fear of not knowing what exactly is coming for you.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Let's go into talking about hard world building. Do you want to talk about Westeros or any of these other ones on the list?
Yeah, I think Westeros is a good example of hard world building. You get a lot of both lore and kind of explanation of these faraway places, these different cultures, these different worlds, basically. And eventually, you do get the payoff. The people do travel there. Some of the characters, anyway, you do get to experience it firsthand after it being kind of briefly described to you earlier, and you get to see it how the author did want to expand on that world from that maybe brief description, maybe a couple of chapters here and there, but you get a real feel of how vast and how different the world is because of that little setup in the beginning.
Yeah. Now, much to your dismay, I have not
Mm,
read the Song of Ice and Fire books,
yeah,
but I have seen House of the Dragon, and I've seen the first 2 or 3 seasons of the show. And one thing I did really like about that is the world is super grounded. It definitely has rules and politics that are firmly put in place, and you have different families that have very different beliefs from each other, very different cultures and just way of living in general. And they all interact. That's what makes the interactions
yeah,
between them so memorable, is because they're having to politically maneuver with other families and other cultures that are very different than their own.
Yeah, of course. You've got some factions that are motivated by money, some are motivated by honor, some are motivated by just getting like expanding the family, getting good ties, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting.
Yeah. One that I had here was Elantris, and I
Okay.
thought this was really cool because this is another example of there's definitely a mystery there, but it's not vague. Like I always
Yeah.
felt like I would get the answer eventually. And when everything is explained, there is a very kind of clear cut, you can put everything into its box as far as like timeline and how everything came to be and how everything works for the most part. There's a couple mysteries that kind of remain, but I think they're meant to be there for future books in the Cosmere. But
Yeah.
that's another book where you can look at it and you're like, and of course it's a Sanderson book, so it's meant to be this way. But you could put everything into kind of like based like an Excel spreadsheet of how
Yeah.
everything is kind of lined out and how everything works.
Yeah, he definitely kind of sows the seeds throughout the story, and then when you get the big reveal, then at the end it all clicks into place
Yeah.
for
And,
sure.
another good example of that too by Sanderson is Scadrial. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but the world is built in a way where at the beginning you're very confused as to how all this came to be, but by the end of the trilogy, it kind of like as you go along, it kind of gives you the events of the past like 100 years or whatever in reverse order, so you
Mm.
kind of reverse engineer how everything came to be. And that's always a really satisfying moment, because everything does make total sense. Like when you have all of the information, it is built in a way where things that we were previously confused on, like why does the world work this way, we get that answer, and there is like a solid reason as to why it does, and it does give you all of the answers that you need for what you've experienced in the story so far.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite parts of Mistborn, discovering the story of the hero of ages and what actually happened to make the world the way it is.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about Lord of the Rings?
Lord of the Rings is it's one of the pinnacles of world building. It's even outside of the trilogy and the Hobbit, you've got YouTube channels dedicated to all the actual lore and world building that goes into
Yeah,
it.
he
It's
wrote his own
completely,
language, several of
yeah,
them.
I know, it's crazy. It's it's just it's even though I wasn't crazy on the actual books itself, I have such a
Sure.
respect for the world of Middle Earth and everything, the history. I'm fascinated by it, but it's just the particular story, the way the books were written just didn't click with me. It wasn't anything wrong with the world building at all. It was just the kind of writing style that
Sure.
Tolkien uses. But the world is amazing. It's the first fantasy world that you would think of. I'd say a lot of people would agree with that.
Yeah, definitely. I
Yeah.
think, it spawned things like Wheel of Time. And
Mm.
I feel like Wheel of Time was kind of like the next successor to Lord of the Rings. And
Yeah.
I believe that Robert Jordan made his world in a really similar way to Tolkien, where
Yeah.
when you look at the two of them side by side, it's like, okay, yeah, that's definitely kind of an inspiration from the structure that Tolkien had for building his world. And yeah, there's tons of I mean, just look at the Silmarillion. He wrote like a
Yeah.
huge history to his world. It's definitely like a hard world building system, even though his magic is a soft system. His
Yeah.
world building is definitely like a straight up like hard world building. He's got all of the history, all of the rules, all of the factions very well laid out. Languages, like we said, that always blows my mind when I realize that he wrote his own language. I think he wrote
It's crazy,
like
isn't it?
a couple of them. Yeah, didn't he write the Orcish language as well as the elves? I can't
Did he?
remember,
Yeah.
but
It's crazy. And then he gives no explanation for Tom Bombadil. Yeah.
I've I've never
I
read the
hate
Lord of
that
the
guy. I
Really?
hate that. Yeah.
Oh man. I've never read Lord of the Rings, so I don't know too much about Tom Bombadil, but everything
Mm.
I hear about him, I'm just like, man, he seems like just such a fun random character. I think I would love him.
Yeah.
All right, so cool. We talked about soft and hard world building. We're about to get out of
Mhm.
here. So at the end of the day, let's kind of take a look at, does good or poor world building affect what we consider our favorite books, ones that we personally enjoyed? Do you feel like it does?
I feel like it can. Uh, I would say the vast majority of my favorite books all have that element of the good world building that I was fascinated. I wanted to stay in that world. I think it would detract if the world building is poor, it does detract from the story for me. I think it's a pretty important part
Mm,
in definitely in my the books that I like to read, my personal style. Um I think 100% it affects my favorite books. What about you?
okay, cool. Yeah, I'm probably on the opposite end of the spectrum.
Okay.
Probably not too far on the opposite end of the spectrum because I do
Mm,
love good world building, like King's Dark Tidings or Scadrial or any of the other ones that are written really well. But I think for me, something like Dresden Files or Harry Potter, where it does kind of have like a softer world building, um, or I guess I wouldn't necessarily say those are poor world building though. They're just a softer system. So
mm,
take something like We Break Immortals. I mentioned that was one where I thought the world building was a little poor in just that we got like too much of it and it was a little clunky. That's one of my favorite books. And so
yeah.
but that being said, I don't have too many other examples outside of that where I thought the world building was specifically poor. I think maybe one that I would say, our next question here is any examples of books that we loved that had poor world building. And I would say Lies of Locke Lamora is one. I think that there's not really a whole lot to that world. And the
Hmm.
magic system, it is a soft system, but it's kind of frustratingly so, where it doesn't really seem like there are any rules even behind the scenes like that the author knows about.
Yeah.
Because when I read Harry Potter, I feel like J.K. Rowling knows what can and can't happen with the magic, but it's just not being told to the reader. With
Yeah.
Lies of Locke Lamora, I feel like the author doesn't even know what the magic system is, and he's not telling that to the reader because he doesn't know what it is. And so
Yeah.
it's kind of like it's just there to move the plot forward. So that can definitely be frustrating, especially when a lot of the like the city that they're in initially and kind of the countries around it aren't really described very well. The story is very much about the characters. Like it's not even really a plot driven story outside of the first book. You're mostly there for the adventures of Locke and John.
Mm,
And so that's like one of my favorite books, like one of my favorite series. I love the Gentleman Bastard series, but the world building is not great. The other
yeah.
one that I have here is the Greenbone Saga. And I think people would argue with me that it does have good world building. I felt like I never really understood what was happening outside of the island that they lived on. Like, what does the American area think of Jade? Like, what does any country outside of this one think of Jade? And I know that they do kind of go to another smaller country that has like a jade underground, and that's kind of explored a little bit, but
Mm,
beyond that I feel like we really didn't learn much about the world in general. We learned about kind of like the political hierarchy and like how all of these different families operate, but I feel like we didn't learn about the history of the world itself. And maybe I need to go back and reread the series, maybe I'm wrong, but I remember coming away with that feeling that way. But I love the Greenbone saga. it's
yeah.
it's definitely a favorite.
I can definitely see what you mean. I agree with you somewhat in terms of the I can't remember the name of the country that's kind of trying to like take the jade and use it for military forces. I would
Mm,
have liked a bit more explanation and
yeah,
deep dive
definitely.
into that. I thought I think is it Espia where Anlin
Yeah.
goes. I liked that world building where it was kind of secretive underground, like you said, it's becoming illegal.
Yeah.
I thought that was okay, not as good as in Kikon itself,
Hmm.
but I agree with you somewhat in terms of the world building there.
See, I probably liked the underground stuff more than anything happening on the main island,
Okay.
because it seemed like there was more at stake. It seemed like there was more that we were learning about, how this culture of people had to operate underground, and there was just more like nuance to it, I guess.
Yeah.
Like on the main island, it just felt like, well, yeah, everybody gets Jade when they turn 18, and it's not really something that's like super special or anything. And
Hmm.
all of these families, like they're all just kind of vying for power. And I liked that. I liked the vying for power. I liked the political maneuvering. But at the underground place, I felt like I was learning about them as a people. And that was just more enticing for me, I felt like.
Yeah, that's fair. I get that.
So what are you have a couple here that you liked that you thought had poor world building that you ended up enjoying?
Yeah, so one of my examples is the Sword of Kaigen. So pretty similar to the Greenbone saga in that respect, where I don't have you read that?
No.
No. So it basically it takes place on this kind of, I guess it's a peninsula on the edge of this continent. There's this city, and all the people in that city are kind of trained to be warriors. They're the ones who will protect the mainland if invaders come,
Hmm.
basically. Um, but you don't really get. I didn't feel like I got enough background as to why, like these people, obviously geographically, the enemies would come in this direction. So I
Hmm.
understand that, but I don't understand like why these specific people were just left there, or why the enemy are even invading, or what the
Hmm.
kind of reason is. Now it's a while since I've read it. Maybe I missed something
Sure.
throughout the story. If I did, let me know in the comments. But for me, I just needed that extra bit of information, kind of like what you said with Greenbone Saga, as to why all this is happening in the world.
Yeah, that's fair. I haven't read that book, but
Mm,
um yeah, I could see that being a frustration for sure.
mm. Like everything, the plot and the action and the characters were really good. It just wanted that extra bit of world building there to make the story kind of fully complete, I guess.
Definitely. And
Uh,
then your other one.
oh yeah, so my other the example here is Memories of Empire, which is from the Tex Kalan series.
Hmm.
Um, it's a space opera kind of sci-fi story,
Oh,
and it's about this basically ambassador, I suppose, who goes to a different planet to be the kind of spokesperson for their group, and they have um, these kind of chips in their head where they basically get the memories from all the previous ambassadors so that they can do a better job. It's a pretty cool premise, but
yeah.
I just didn't find anything kind of exciting or exhilarating about the world building. I just found it pretty boring.
Oh,
Just
okay.
it was basically just people in space. I didn't find anything
Right.
unique about it, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, there's no like big culture
Not really.
separating a lot of the
They've got stuff like their names are different, like their and poetry is a big part of their culture and stuff like that. But
yeah.
it just felt uh, like it didn't really have that extra bit that makes it unique, makes it something different, makes it more engaging for the reader, you know?
Yeah. So two other ones that would have been great to bring up earlier too would be Red Rising and The Expanse. And I feel like those were I mean, they don't really fit into exactly what we're talking about now, because I feel like they had good world building and good stories for the most part. The Expanse didn't quite land the ending for me. But Red Rising, I love that series and I feel like it has really, really good world building.
Yeah,
That's one that it's all set up in this hierarchy way, but like every different place has like a very different culture that you learn about. And yeah, that's really well written world building as well.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
So then let's flip that real quick before we go. So uh books that we didn't like that had good world building. And I think for me, the one that really pops to mind, the one that fits this the most, is the Foundry side books. Um, and I enjoyed the first book a lot, and then the second book I thought was like okay, like everybody else seemed to enjoy it a lot more than I did. And then the third book I just outright hated. I hated the third book so
Hey,
much. But the world that they've set up here is so cool because you learn about this city and the history of it, and you learn that at some point, basically civilization was advancing along, in a pretty normal way, and then gradually over time they figured out that they could inscribe certain ruins onto objects and give them a purpose. Like the example that kind of everybody uses is that if you have a cart, you could inscribe a rune onto the wheels that would tell it would tell the wheels that they are rolling downhill, even if
okay,
they're not. And so they could be flat and the wheels would roll forward because the runes are telling them that they're on a slanted surface. And then you have some sort of control device at the top where you like put one rune against another and it contacts the other runes at the wheels. And it gets really, really complicated. And it gives the history of Tien, I think is the city. And it gives the history of like how all of this came to be and how this inscribing got to a point where now they have these big like big inscribed like buildings and stuff that are just massive and super super intricate. And with each book that magic system grows and grows and grows. The problem is by the time you get to the third book, technically, if you can follow along with how the magic has changed and evolved, then you should be able to understand what's going on. But there was just so much bloat and so much like just like info dump and info dump and info dump about how the
yeah,
magic, because there's like a time jump between books 2 and 3. There's like 10 years that have gone by, and so it's trying to catch you up on how this like technology, basically like magical technology, has evolved. But it's
okay,
like, man, I didn't have nearly enough time to like follow all of this along. Like now the magic is like basically a completely different story. Like it's a completely different thing now because it evolved so much. um
okay,
but yeah, by the time I got to the end of that book, I was just like, I just did not enjoy my time with this in the slightest. Like I just had no idea what was going on by the end, and it felt like it's not like Malazan where it feels like a book that I can't follow. This felt like
mm,
a book that I should have been able to follow. It just wasn't written well.
okay.
And so the world building was incredible, but everything else just kind of fell flat for me.
And do you think it was like the author trying to overdo it,
Yeah,
or yeah,
I think he had this grand idea and he didn't know how to execute it, and it felt really rushed.
and
And
forced, yeah,
yeah, and really if he wanted the reader to eventually get to that point where the magical technology is like super super advanced, then it should have been like a 5 or 6 book series to like get us there.
yeah,
But you can't just take like a couple chapters and try to cram in everything that made the magic evolve to the point where it's at. It's just really really tough to do, and I know it lost a lot of people.
yeah.
So tell me about Crescent City.
So Crescent City, I read the first book. I think it was called The House of Blood and Earth, by Sarah J. Maas. Probably going to get a lot of haters in the in the comments now for dissing Sarah J. Maas, but it was it was a kind of a setting that I really liked. This it's like an urban fantasy, but like you've got angels, demons, all these different type of magical creatures living in amongst humans,
Hmm.
and it's just like that kind of regular life, but incorporating these different types of species and stuff like that, which I thought was really cool. You know, there's werewolves, there's everything you can think of,
Hmm.
but then just the story was just became a romance about some guy is it's becomes
Rippling abs.
infatuated, yeah, with wings and a six pack, and he obviously falls in love with the main character. I think he's essentially like a detective, and he's protecting her. Falls in love, um, for no other reason, but just because they're both the main characters. You know,
Right, right.
it's
Sounds like a
it.
Sarah J. Maas book.
Yeah, it was. I don't know. I can't remember why I picked it up in the first place, but I just thought I'd give it a try. I heard it was pretty good. I think it was free on like my library audiobook app. And this, I mean, the plot was okay, but it was just got derailed by the too much romance and that kind of not YA, I guess,
Yeah,
tropiness, but I think
yeah,
you know what I'm trying to say. Just the
yeah, for
romance
sure.
overtook it when it's if the romance hadn't been there, if another author had written that type of story, I might have really enjoyed it,
Right,
but just
right.
didn't get me at all.
Okay. Well, the last one that I'll bring up here is Of Blood and Fire by Ryan Cahill. And I know that I'll
Okay.
get a bunch of hate in the comments because people love
Mm,
this series. And I'll just say real quick, like, I don't want to diss Ryan in any way.
mm,
Like, this isn't a problem with his writing or anything like that. He writes really, really good books. It's just not the kind of thing that is for me necessarily. Um, and so it's one of those things where the world building is really, really good. Like I really enjoyed kind of all the different stuff that he was doing with the world, and it seemed really interesting. And even the plot, I remember, I can't remember too much about the book, but I remember the plot being fairly interesting. But then on the flip side of it, I really didn't like the main character. He was like this kid who was like, I think he's like 13 in the first book or something. And somehow all of these like older men and women who are like battle hardened warriors decide to follow him. And I was just
yeah,
like, oh, that's just not working for me. And it didn't even really feel YA necessarily. It just felt like, I don't know, something about it. Like I just don't really like typical fantasy books. And I think that I'm realizing that more and more. Like with the Rhyuria stuff, there's a couple different reasons why I don't like that series, but the main one is that it just felt like fantasy. Like it just felt like fantasy ass fantasy where you have like your elves and your dwarves and stuff.
yeah,
And that's kind of what this felt like, even though this is significantly more well done than anything in the Rhyuria Revelations. It's just one of those things where I'm like, this probably isn't for me. However, I have heard people tell me like just keep going, and it evolves and it becomes like kind of a different thing. And
yeah,
so I've been wanting to do that. I've been wanting to give it a second chance because I feel like Ryan Cahill has definitely earned a second chance. If anyone has, he definitely has.
yeah, yeah. I just picked up the first two books the other day, but I get what you're saying. It's kind of that classic fantasy kind of setup of the
Yeah.
story, which I know you much prefer your modern fantasy and
Mm.
stuff like that. So
Yeah.
I get that.
All right. Well, before we go, do you want to talk about The Hobbit?
Yeah, once again, probably we'll get some more hate for this one. I know I got a lot of hate on Twitter when I reviewed it. I think I gave it 1 star. But we talked already about the Lord of the Rings, Middle Earth. Such fantastic world building, really great setting. Just Bilbo Baggins is annoying. The dwarves are just, I felt like too goofy
Yeah.
for the world itself,
Yeah.
You're it's it just didn't feel right for me. It's like a crazy adventure, like you're going to fight a dragon basically, and it just felt like a comedy. I know it's kind of aimed more towards a younger
Younger.
audience,
Yeah.
yeah, which fair enough, and a lot of people
Sure.
like it. I've got no problem with people liking it. It just wasn't for me. I just wanted something different from that world as opposed to a
Right.
bunch of goofy elves getting into all different types of conundrums.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah.
Well, that kind of brings us to the end of of everything we had in our notes, I feel like we had
Yeah.
a really good discussion. This was supposed, if our listeners can believe it, this
Mhm.
episode or this video was supposed to be a 30-minute Saturday video for you
Yeah.
guys, but at some point it turned into a podcast episode, and
Yeah.
I'm totally okay with that. I think that, you know,
Yeah.
I was kind of watching the clock for a while, and then I was like, you know what? We're having a good conversation. Like, I'm just gonna let it flow. And I feel like we hit a lot of really good points. I feel like this is probably, out of all of our podcast episodes, this is probably our most concise one, which
Yeah.
is telling you something.
Yeah.
But but yeah, I had a really good time kind of looking at these worlds, and I feel like world building isn't something that I typically think too much about. Like I mentioned at the top, I think that I'm much more of like a character and plot driven reader, and I don't really think about the world building too deeply.
Mhm.
And so it was a really cool opportunity for me to kind of take a step back and look at some of these worlds I like, and kind of, hash out like, what do I like about these worlds and what don't I like about these worlds, and just kind of world building and fantasy in general. So yeah, this was a really good time for me. Did you like
Yeah,
talking about world building?
yeah, definitely. I totally agree with you there. It's something that I kind of notice when I read the book, but don't think too much about how it actually affected my reading of the story. Whereas looking back, I can see kind of those links once I actually think more about what the actual world building was. Whereas when I'm in the story, I'm just kind of letting it pass me by sometimes. So
Right.
definitely good to discuss it, and I could try and be more conscious of it, I suppose, in the future.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for hanging out with me and talking world building. This was a ton
Yeah,
of
it was a
fun.
lot of fun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Well, we are going to wrap it up there. Let us know in the comments what you think makes a truly fantastic world. What are some of your favorite books or series with exceptional world building? If you'd like to chat further about world building or whatever, reach out to us on Twitter or Discord, linked in the description. And if you'd like some exclusive content, you can help us pay the bills on Patreon, which we will be adding more content to soon. Like, subscribe, you know what to do at this point, all the YouTube stuff. And we will see you next week on the Fantasy Files podcast. Sweet.
Nice. That was pretty good.
And a big shout out to our first Night Angel tier patron, Shad Zaman. Thank you so much, man.